The sea was quiet that night, a sheet of endless darkness stretching beyond sight, its surface trembling faintly under the pale glow of a waning moon. Beneath that calm, unseen by the world above, steel and men moved through the depths, a single submarine, the USS Archerfish, gliding silently through the black. Inside her cramped compartments, air was thick with oil and metal, the low hum of machinery mixing with the rhythmic pulse of sonar. Every creak, every hiss of pressure was a reminder that death lay inches away on the other side of the hull. And yet, for the men aboard her, this was the world they knew. The Pacific was their battlefield, and on this November night in 1944, destiny was about to place them face to face with a monster no one had ever truly expected to find. Far above, another vessel cut through the dark waters of the Philippine Sea, massive and heavy, its very presence bending the waves around it. The ship's outline was faint under the dim light, but to those who saw her, she seemed like a moving fortress. Her name was Shinano, a name whispered in secrecy by the Imperial Japanese Navy, a ship so large and so powerful that even her own sailors struggled to believe she existed. She was the pride of Japan, the last desperate gamble of an empire on the brink of collapse. Built on the hull of a battleship and converted into an aircraft carrier, Shinano was meant to be unsinkable, an armored giant rising from the failures of Yamato and Musashi. She was longer than any ship afloat, armored thicker than any carrier ever made, and built to carry the war back across the Pacific. But war is not kind to dreams. The Japanese Empire was already bleeding. Its fleets lay shattered, its air force gutted, and its shipyards crippled. Shinano was launched before she was ready, rushed into service with her systems incomplete, her crew untested, her purpose clouded by desperation. Even as she left the dockyards of Yokosuka, her pumps were unfinished, her bulkheads unsealed, and her men scarcely trained. She was a weapon born too late, burdened by the ambitions of those who could no longer afford to fail. On board, Captain Toshio Abe walked the decks in silence, his face illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns and instruments. He was a man of discipline and pride, a veteran who understood both the power and fragility of steel. Around him, hundreds of sailors worked with quiet urgency, each carrying out duties they barely understood. The ship was new, massive beyond imagination, so vast that orders had to travel by messenger rather than voice. The decks echoed with the sound of hammers and boots. Even as she sailed, crews tightened bolts and checked watertight doors that were not yet properly sealed. But the order from high command was clear. Shinano must reach Kure Naval Base. She was to be completed and armed there, her decks filled with aircraft that might yet turn the tide of war. And so, unfinished or not, she sailed. In the deep, Archerfish continued her patrol, her captain, Commander Joseph Enright, studying the charts under dim red light. The crew had been at sea for weeks, scanning the waters for targets that never appeared. Morale was thin. The Pacific was vast and empty, and many submarines returned home without glory. But Enright was determined that his boat would not. He knew that somewhere in these waters, the remnants of Japan's navy were trying to flee south. His orders were to intercept any vessel he could find, and that night, the radar operator broke the monotony with 4 words that electrified the control room. Contact on the surface. The men snapped into motion. The radar blip was faint but massive. It moved slowly, deliberately, flanked by smaller dots, likely destroyers. Enright's heart began to pound. Whatever this was, it wasn't a merchant. It was something big, something important. He gave the order to shadow the contact. The submarine surfaced just enough for its periscope to rise above the waves. Through the lens, Enright saw it, a dark silhouette against the horizon, enormous, towering even in the distance. He couldn't identify it, but its size alone told him it was no ordinary target. He thought it might be a Shokaku-class carrier, but this seemed even larger. The escorts moved in a defensive zigzag pattern, protecting their prize as it steamed west. Enright realized he had stumbled upon something rare, a major warship, possibly fresh from the docks. The hours that followed were a test of endurance. Archerfish tailed the unknown ship for the entire night, staying just out of visual range, careful to remain undetected. The ocean was calm, and calm seas were dangerous for submarines. The smoother the water, the easier it was for the enemy to spot a periscope wake. But Enright took the risk. He knew an opportunity like this came once in a career, perhaps once in a lifetime. Inside the sub, the men whispered in the dim red glow of the control room, tension wrapping around them like a coil. Every adjustment of the rudder, every change in depth was deliberate. Sweat trickled down faces, but no one dared complain. They all knew what was at stake. Somewhere above them, a giant floated, and if they could bring her down, they would carve their names into history. Back aboard Shinano, the mood was different. Her officers believed the voyage would be routine. They had no idea that an American submarine lurked beneath them. The night air was cold, the wind sharp across the flight deck. Sailors leaned on railings, staring out into the darkness, thinking of home and of the war that seemed never to end. The ship moved slowly, not yet capable of full speed, her engines still being tested. Her escorting destroyers moved in cautious loops around her. But the ocean was wide and empty. They felt safe. But the sea, that vast and silent battlefield, hides everything, including death. As dawn approached, Enright decided to stay with the target through the day. He ordered the submarine to submerge deeper, avoiding detection as the sun rose. Through the periscope, he watched the ship's gray hull glint faintly under the light. He studied her lines, her towers, her vast, unending deck. Whoever built her had created something extraordinary. But Enright also saw something else: vulnerability. For all her size, the ship's escort pattern was lazy. Her speed was inconsistent. Her crew seemed inexperienced. There were gaps, openings, moments of opportunity. He waited. Hours turned to afternoon, then evening. The hunt stretched on. The ocean, endless and silent, tested the patience of every man aboard Archerfish. Finally, as darkness returned, the chance came. The Japanese carrier slowed slightly, turning into a course that would bring her broadside to the submarine. Enright's voice was calm but hard. "This is it," he said quietly. "We'll take her now." The crew moved with purpose. Torpedo tubes were flooded. The target's range was closing fast. Every man aboard knew that one mistake could mean death. But if they succeeded, it would be the greatest kill in submarine history. Enright waited until the moment was perfect. Through the periscope, the target filled his vision, a dark wall of steel sliding silently across the sea. He gave the order, "Fire 1." The smell of oil and burning insulation filled the corridors of the giant ship as the crew of Shinano struggled to understand what had happened. Moments before, they had been calm, confident, even bored. Now, alarms screamed through every deck. Voices shouted orders that were swallowed by the roaring of the sea as water poured. Through torn metal, the ship shuddered again, a deep groan from her belly as if the steel itself were crying out. Captain Toshio Abe stood on the bridge, gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face was pale but composed, his eyes fixed on the damage reports flooding in. 4 torpedoes, maybe more, had struck along the port side. He didn't know from where or from what. The destroyers circling nearby reported no surface attackers. The sky was clear. Only one explanation remained, and it chilled him more than the wind. A submarine. Below, in the darkness of the compartments, men waded through rising water. Some carried flashlights, others used whatever light they could find to seal hatches and drag injured sailors away from flooding rooms. Steam hissed through ruptured pipes, scalding anyone too close. The water was cold and relentless. Pumps whirred but sputtered. The electric systems had taken damage from the shock. Some men prayed, others cursed, shouting for tools, for help, for anything that could stop the incoming flood. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with bare hands. Abe barked orders into the communication tubes, demanding reports from engineering. His officers were already panicking, some struggling to interpret conflicting readings from half-dead instruments. The flooding was spreading. The watertight bulkheads that should have sealed off damaged. Sections had failed to close in time. Some were stuck halfway, others leaked at the seams. The unfinished state of the ship was now its greatest enemy. Where armor should have protected her, gaps in the welds and incomplete sealants allowed water to seep through. Still, Abe refused to surrender to panic. "We will stabilize," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get the pumps running. Evacuate the lower decks. Focus on the engineering spaces first. We must maintain propulsion." He believed that if they could keep the engines alive, they might limp back to safety. The ship was immense. Surely she could withstand this. But the truth was crueler than any man on that bridge wished to admit. As the crew fought the flooding, the destroyers above continued to hunt the invisible enemy. Depth charges exploded in distant intervals, sending columns of foam and vibration through the water. The noise echoed through Shinano's hull, rattling loose equipment and shaking the nerves of every man inside. Yet, the submarine that had delivered the deadly blow was already gone. Archerfish had slipped quietly beneath the surface, moving away at a slow crawl, listening. Commander Enright stood in the control room, his face illuminated by dim red light. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The sonar operator's face said everything. The echo patterns had changed. The target was slowing, listing, dying. The crew of Archerfish knew they had hit something massive, something unlike any ship they had ever faced. Enright didn't yet know the name of his prey, but deep down, he felt it. This was no ordinary carrier or battleship. This was something legendary. He ordered silence, keeping the sub deep until the danger passed. The destroyers hunted for hours, but their quarry had vanished into the cold void. Back aboard Shinano, the minutes stretched into hours. The damage reports grew worse. The flooding had reached several compartments along the port side. Crewmen tried to pump water out, but power loss forced them to use hand pumps and buckets. The ship began to tilt more noticeably now, a slow but steady list to port that made walking difficult. Officers shouted at men to move ammunition and supplies to the starboard side in a desperate attempt to counterbalance the weight. Some obeyed. Others froze, too exhausted or terrified to continue. By midnight, Captain Abe realized the true scope of the disaster. The giant carrier was losing stability. The compartments below decks were flooded beyond recovery, and the pumps could not keep pace. The ship's immense size worked against her. It took too long for orders to reach the necessary stations, too long for men to move between bulkheads. Many of the crew had never been trained for this kind of emergency. They didn't even know the layout of the ship completely. Corridors led to unfinished sections. Ladders ended abruptly in blocked passages. Some tried to escape through vents or machinery spaces, only to be trapped as the water rose. Above deck, the wind had picked up. Waves slammed against the side of the wounded ship, each impact adding strain to the hull. Men struggled to keep their footing as the deck tilted more with each passing hour. The destroyers remained close, signaling to Abe and offering assistance. But towing the massive carrier was impossible in the rough seas. They could only circle helplessly as the once mighty Shinano fought for her life. In the control room of Archerfish, the atmosphere was tense but calm. The crew could feel the weight of what they had done, though none of them dared to celebrate. And Wright finally allowed himself to exhale, looking over at his men. "We did our job," he said softly. "Now we survive." He knew that if the escorts ever found them, it would be over. But luck was with them. The Japanese destroyers never located the source of the attack. By dawn, Archerfish was miles away, leaving behind only silence and the fading heartbeat of a dying colossus. As the hours passed, Shinano's situation worsened. The engineers reported that the main pumps were overheating. Some of the backup power systems were offline. Steam pressure dropped. The giant slowed to a crawl, barely moving forward. Abe's officers urged him to beach the ship, to turn toward the nearest shore, but they were too far from land. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, mocking their efforts. Abe ordered every man who could fight the flooding to do so. He would not abandon ship, not yet. By 2 a.m., the list had reached a dangerous angle. The carrier tilted more than 10 degrees to port. Men could no longer stand upright. Equipment slid across the decks. Water continued to pour through ruptured seams in the lower hull. Damage control teams fought bravely, but the lack of proper training and organization doomed their efforts. Many were young recruits, barely trained, barely old enough to shave. They worked until exhaustion took them, until the freezing seawater reached their waists, until they could no longer hold the flashlight steady in their hands. Abe walked among them, calm and commanding, trying to restore order. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with oil, but his voice remained steady. He promised them that they would make it, that Shinano could not sink, that the ship was too large, too strong, too well built to die. But even he could see the truth in the trembling of the deck, in the slow groaning of the hull as it bent under its own weight. By dawn, the sea was gray and still. The first light revealed the true horror of the damage. The port side was low in the water, the bow slightly dipped. Crewmen lined the decks, exhausted and shivering, watching as water sloshed across the lower flight deck. The destroyers drew closer, signaling again, but no reply came. Abe was silent. He stood on the bridge, watching the horizon, his jaw set. His ship was doomed and he knew it. He ordered preparations for evacuation, but even that was chaos. The lifeboats were incomplete, many still sealed or missing fittings. Men tried to use rafts and wooden planks. Some refused to leave, unwilling to abandon the vessel they had believed was unsinkable. Others prayed silently as the sea began to claim the lower decks. Below, the last of the pumps failed. The flooding surged unchecked. One final shudder ran through the hull, a deep moan like the cry of a wounded animal. And then, slowly, the ship began to roll. The tilt increased. Men screamed. Those still on deck ran to the starboard side, clinging to railings, sliding across the wet metal as the carrier leaned farther and farther. Abe stayed where he was, one hand on the railing, his eyes never leaving the horizon. There was no panic in him now, only resignation. He gave his final order: abandon ship. The destroyers rushed in to rescue survivors as the massive vessel turned on her side. The noise was deafening, the sound of collapsing bulkheads, the roaring of water rushing through open hatches. For a moment, it seemed as if the ship might hang there, half submerged, defying gravity. But then, with a final groan, the ocean claimed her. The largest warship ever built by Japan, and the largest carrier in history, slipped beneath the waves. Hundreds of men were pulled from the water. Thousands more went down with her. Captain Abe was among the lost. In less than 7 hours, the Shinano, symbol of Japanese pride in naval engineering, had vanished into the depths, destroyed by 4 torpedoes from a single submarine. Miles away, aboard Archerfish, the crew still didn't know the scale of what they had done. They knew they had sunk a large ship, but not that they had just destroyed the largest warship ever to sail. Enright recorded the event in his log, listing the coordinates, the estimated tonnage, the number of torpedoes fired. Only weeks later, when American intelligence confirmed the sinking, did the truth reach him. The impossible had happened. A single submarine had taken down a steel giant. The ocean rolled on, indifferent as always. The men who survived the sinking would tell their stories years later. Speaking of chaos, of courage, of a ship that never had the chance to fulfill her purpose. And deep beneath the waters, the wreck of Shinano settled into silence, her vast hull swallowed by mud and memory. The hunter had vanished into history, and the hunted had become a legend. The ocean returned to silence as if it had erased the violence of the night. Only a few floating remnants remained, oil slicks shimmering in the gray dawn, debris turning slowly in the gentle swells, and survivors clinging to whatever pieces of the great ship they could find. The destroyers that had escorted Shinano circled in disbelief. The sea had swallowed her whole. For hours, sailors scanned the water, calling out for comrades who no longer answered. The air was thick with the smell of oil and salt, mingled with the faint cries of men drifting farther apart with each passing minute. The waves had grown calm again, but beneath them lay thousands of tons of twisted steel and hundreds of souls. Among those rescued were engineers, deckhands, and junior officers, men who would spend the rest of their lives replaying those final moments in their minds. Their stories, pieced together later by investigators, painted a picture not just of a ship lost to torpedoes, but of a war machine undone by its own haste and hubris. Some remembered the sound of bulkheads snapping, like thunder echoing through tunnels. Others recalled the eerie calm just before the ship began to roll, when the noise suddenly stopped and only the groan of bending steel could be heard. A few claimed they saw Captain Abe standing on the bridge until the very end, refusing to leave his post. The sinking of Shinano stunned the Japanese Navy. She had been a secret weapon, a symbol of hope in an increasingly hopeless war. Her loss, barely a week after leaving port, was not only a military failure, but a psychological blow. Few in Japan even knew she existed. Fewer still could believe that such a ship could sink so quickly. The official announcement was buried in silence, her name omitted from dispatches, her fate whispered only among officers who knew the truth. Pride forbade public mourning for a ship that had never even seen battle. In the following days, Japanese engineers gathered in disbelief. The blueprints that had promised invincibility now seemed like mockery. How could a ship with armor thicker than any carrier before it, a hull designed to resist bombs and torpedoes alike, have gone down to a single submarine attack? They pored over survivor accounts, reconstructing the sequence of events. Every detail mattered. The torpedo impacts, the flooding, the failed pumps, the open hatches, the chaos in the lower compartments. Bit by bit, the terrible truth became clear. It wasn't one flaw that doomed Shinano, but a chain of small failures, each feeding the next until the giant was consumed. She had sailed without her full damage control equipment. Her watertight doors had not been properly tested. Her crew, drawn from across the fleet, had received only minimal training. Incomplete bulkheads and missing valves allowed the floodwater to spread unchecked. Some pumps were still being installed when she departed. The decision to send her to sea had been driven not by readiness, but by fear. Fear of American bombers. Fear that Yokosuka would soon be under attack. Fear that keeping her in port would mean losing her before she even launched. In their rush to save her, they had delivered her to death. The irony was bitter. Shinano had been born from the wreckage of Yamato's sister hull, rebuilt to embody Japan's belief that massive strength could still turn the war. Yet in the end, all her armor and size could not protect her from a handful of torpedoes and a crew of 70 men moving through the darkness. She was a floating fortress undone by the invisible hand of stealth and precision. The age of the battleship was ending, and the ocean had chosen its proof. Far away, the men of the USS Archerfish were still unaware of the magnitude of their victory. They had spent the next days in silence, running submerged to avoid pursuit. The attack had been swift and decisive, but their training demanded caution. Only when they surfaced under the cover of night did Enright allow himself a brief smile. His crew was exhausted, tense, hungry, but alive. They had risked everything on a single attack run, and it had worked. "We hit her good," Enright told his executive officer quietly. "She's not coming back." He was right. But even as they turned for home, he could not have imagined that the ship they had sunk was the largest warship ever built, larger even than the Yamato herself. It would take months for intelligence to confirm it. And when the news finally came, the realization left even Enright stunned. His small diesel submarine, weighing barely 2,000 tons, had destroyed a Leviathan nearly 30 times its size. For the men aboard Archerfish, the patrol became legend. They spoke of the moment the torpedoes hit, the way the sound traveled through the steel hull, the deep thud, the rising tremor, and then that distant echo of destruction. Some claimed they could feel it in their bones. Others remembered the silence afterward, the heavy stillness that followed victory when no one dared speak. Even in triumph, there was a kind of reverence for the sea, for the lives lost, and for the strange symmetry of war. When Archerfish finally returned to Pearl Harbor, she was met not with parades but with questions. Her logbooks were examined, her attack maps compared against intelligence reports. Only when analysts realized that the tonnage of the ship she had sunk far exceeded any known vessel did they begin to grasp the truth. News spread quickly through the submarine force. A single patrol, a single engagement, and the largest carrier in history was gone. The men of Archerfish had written their names into naval history. But beneath the pride, there was a quiet understanding of what that victory meant. Every man aboard knew that. Somewhere in the cold depths of the Pacific lay hundreds of sailors who had fought to survive. Just as they had, the ocean had no sides. It swallowed men without prejudice. For every submarine crew that returned home in triumph, another vanished without trace. War at sea was not glory. It was survival, measured in torpedoes and tonnage, in luck and silence. In Tokyo, the loss of Shinano was kept secret until the end of the war. The Japanese Navy could not afford to reveal that its greatest ship had been destroyed before it ever fought. Even among officers, her name became taboo. Those who had served aboard her were reassigned or silenced, their records buried. Only after Japan's surrender did the world learn her fate, that a ship designed to defy destruction had been undone by the very enemy it was meant to defeat. In America, the story became a symbol of submarine warfare at its peak. It was proof that the silent service, often overlooked, often underappreciated, had changed the balance of power in the Pacific. Submarines had become the great equalizers, capable of striking anywhere, anytime, against any target. They required no fleet, no air cover, no fanfare, only patience, precision, and courage. The sinking of Shinano was not just a victory. It was a turning point in the psychology of naval warfare. It demonstrated beyond doubt that size and armor no longer guaranteed safety. The world's largest warship had fallen to one of its smallest hunters. The rules of the ocean had changed forever. Still, for those who had been there, the memory was not triumph, but awe. Survivors from Shinano spoke of the darkness, of the terrible weight of water, of the way the ship seemed to breathe as she died. Some said they could feel her heartbeat slow, that the vibrations through the deck seemed to fade until nothing remained. They described the moments before she capsized, the tilt so sharp that men slid down the deck into the freezing sea. They spoke of Captain Abe's final command, and of the eerie quiet that followed her disappearance beneath the waves. The wreck of Shinano would remain undiscovered for decades, lying deep beneath the surface, hidden by layers of mud and time. When explorers finally found her, she was resting on her side, her great hull broken but recognizable, her vast decks silent. The ocean had preserved her like a monument, a reminder of ambition, courage, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. Above her, ships still pass, their wakes fading quickly, their crews unaware that beneath them lies the ghost of a giant. And somewhere in the long corridors of naval memory, the story of that night still echoes, the clash between the hunter and the hunted, between stealth and power, between man's dreams of invincibility and the reality that the sea spares no one. Dawn broke quietly over the Pacific, the sky painted in streaks of pale gold and steel blue. The sea was calm again, as if it had already forgotten the violence that had unfolded beneath its surface. For the men of the USS Archerfish, that morning felt surreal. The ocean that had been their battleground only hours ago now shimmered like glass, reflecting the first light of day. They didn't know it yet, but they had just changed naval history. Inside the narrow steel corridors of the submarine, a strange silence lingered. The men spoke in low tones, some sipping the last of their coffee, others replaying the attack in their minds. There was no celebration, only a quiet disbelief. Commander Joseph Enright leaned against the periscope housing, staring at the chart table. The ship they had sunk still haunted his mind. Its size, its speed, the sheer silhouette that had filled his scope before disappearing into the black water. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was something extraordinary. He had served long enough to know when an enemy vessel was unusual, and that one had felt different. The shape of the bow, the massive superstructure, the aircraft elevators visible even in the faint moonlight. None of it matched the usual Japanese carriers. "Whatever she was," his executive officer murmured, "she's gone." Enright nodded, but his eyes were far away. "Yes," he said quietly, "and someday we'll find out who she was." For now, there was no time to linger. The submarine's orders were clear: avoid detection, report the contact, and return to base. The ocean could turn from calm to chaos in minutes, and every sound, every radar ping, every distant propeller could mean death. For the next few days, Archerfish moved like a shadow, running deep during daylight, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and send coded messages. The men grew weary, but stayed alert. Their prize lay somewhere beneath the waves, unseen and unconfirmed, but they carried with them the quiet confidence of hunters who had struck true. When the first decoded report reached Pearl Harbor, the reaction was cautious. Intelligence officers cross-checked every detail of Enright's report: the location, the estimated size, the number of torpedo hits. Something didn't fit. The tonnage he reported was far beyond any known Japanese ship operating in those waters. Analysts speculated it might have been a converted carrier or an auxiliary vessel. No one dared believe that a new supercarrier, one so massive it defied categorization, had been at sea. It wasn't until months later, after Japan's surrender, that the truth would surface, that Enright and his crew had sunk the Shinano, the largest warship ever built. In Japan, the loss of Shinano rippled through the corridors of power like a silent earthquake. The Imperial Navy, already reeling from defeats at Leyte Gulf and the relentless advance of American forces, could barely afford another humiliation. But this one was beyond comprehension. A vessel meant to symbolize Japan's naval rebirth had perished without firing a shot. High Command ordered strict secrecy. Even most officers were told only that Shinano had met with an unfortunate accident. Only a handful knew the full truth, and they were sworn to silence. For the engineers who had labored over her massive hull, the loss was personal. They had spent years rebuilding her from the skeleton of a battleship into what was supposed to be an unsinkable carrier. Every rivet, every bulkhead had been a promise that Japan could still command the seas. Yet within hours, all of it was gone. Reports trickled in from survivors, describing the chaos on board, the flooding, the power failures, the desperate attempts to save her. As the details emerged, the blame began to circulate. Some pointed to the rushed construction, others to Captain Abe's decision to sail without full testing, and still others to the flawed damage control procedures that had plagued Japan's Navy since the start of the war. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Shinano had been doomed long before the torpedoes struck. The empire she was built to protect was crumbling. The resources that should have ensured her completion had been scattered across a dozen desperate fronts. The fuel that powered her engines was running out. The pilots who might have flown her aircraft were already gone. She was a masterpiece launched in a world that no longer had room for her. While Japan mourned in silence, America celebrated without knowing. The submarine force had become one of the most effective weapons in the Pacific. Small, silent, and devastating. By 1944, U.S. submarines accounted for over half of all Japanese shipping losses. They starved the empire of oil, food, and steel, sinking freighters, tankers, and even warships with relentless precision. Yet even among those victories, what Archerfish had done stood apart. They hadn't just sunk a ship, they had sunk a symbol. In Washington, word of the sinking reached naval intelligence circles with growing excitement. At first, it was classified as a large aircraft carrier. But as post-war reports came in and Japan's ship registries were examined, the enormity of the achievement became clear. Shinano had displaced over 70,000 tons, larger than any carrier ever built before or since. The scale of her destruction stunned even hardened admirals. The one submarine, a report later noted, has changed the calculus of sea power. Commander Enright was summoned to receive the Navy Cross, though he remained humble about the accomplishment. In interviews, he spoke more about his crew than himself, about the discipline, the patience, the teamwork that made the attack possible. "We did our job," he said simply. The sea did the rest. For the men of Archerfish, that patrol became legend. In the bars and mess halls of Pearl Harbor, Younger submariners listened in awe as the story was retold. The night the smallest hunter brought down the largest prey. But even in triumph, Enright couldn't help thinking of the men who had gone down with Shinano. He knew what it was like to be trapped beneath the sea, to feel the hull groan around you, to pray that the pressure didn't crush you alive. Every submariner knew that feeling, the thin steel wall separating life from oblivion. "They fought like sailors," he said once when asked about the enemy. "And the sea took them, same as it could take us." Years later, when peace returned and the world began to rebuild, the story of Shinano resurfaced. Historians and naval experts pored over her blueprints, examining every aspect of her design. They found brilliance and tragedy intertwined, innovations, years ahead of their time, undone by human error and desperation. She had been built to carry 100 aircraft, protected by armor so thick it could withstand near-direct bomb hits. But in trying to make her invincible, engineers had made her inflexible. Her vast compartments became traps when water breached them. Her armor made repairs nearly impossible once damage spread. She was a fortress that could not adapt, the last breath of an old way of thinking in a new kind of war. The wreck of Shinano lay undiscovered for decades. Explorers and historians searched, guided by survivor accounts and wartime charts, but the ocean kept her secret. It wasn't until sonar, mapping in the 1980s, that researchers finally located her. Resting place, deep beneath the waves, resting on her side in eternal silence. The wreck revealed the scars of the attack, the 4 torpedo holes still visible, the twisted steel where compartments had imploded under pressure. Nature had claimed her, but she remained eerily preserved, a cathedral of rust in the darkness. Those who visited her through remote submersibles described the scene as haunting. Fish darted through open hangars where once aircraft had been stored. Coral had grown along her flight deck, softening the outlines of war. The great ship no longer inspired fear or pride, only reverence. It was as if the ocean itself had forgiven her, wrapping her in layers of silt and stillness. For the families of those who perished, the discovery brought a strange peace. Letters were written, prayers offered, and memorials held quietly in Japan. Survivors who were still alive wept when they saw the photographs. "She looks as if she's still waiting," one said, waiting for orders that never came. And perhaps in a way she was. For all her power and majesty, Shinano never had a chance to fulfill her purpose. She had been conceived in pride, born in haste, and destroyed by fate. Yet her story lived on, not as a tale of failure, but as a warning about the dangers of arrogance and the illusion of invincibility. In the cold silence of the deep, surrounded by the ghosts of a vanished war, the largest warship in history sleeps, not as a symbol of strength, but as a monument to the men who built her, sailed her, and died with her. And above, the waves whisper the same truth they have whispered since time began, that in the end, the sea always wins. The war was ending. Japan was collapsing from within, its cities in ruins, its navy scattered, its skies ruled by American bombers. But deep in the Pacific, one silent victory still echoed beneath the waves. The night a single American submarine brought down the greatest warship ever built. The name of that ship, once hidden, now became a legend whispered through both navies, Shinano. Months after the attack, as American forces pushed toward Tokyo, analysts began to uncover the truth about what had happened. The Japanese had tried to erase all record of the disaster. Officially, Shinano had failed to return, but buried documents, decoded communications, and the testimony of survivors told a different story. One of overconfidence, human error, and the cold precision of fate. The loss of Shinano was more than a military defeat. It was a symbol of an empire's unraveling. In Washington, the news reached the upper echelons of command quietly but powerfully. Reports from the USS Archerfish confirmed that the submarine's target had been massive, far beyond anything previously encountered. The post-war analysis revealed that Archerfish had achieved something almost unimaginable. A small diesel submarine, built for stealth and endurance, had destroyed a warship more than 30 times its size. Commander Enright's patrol became the stuff of naval legend. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the truth about Shinano's destruction was beginning to emerge in captured documents. American intelligence officers, combing through the ruins of the Japanese Navy Ministry, uncovered blueprints, memos, and eyewitness accounts. There it was in stark black ink, Shinano, a 72,000-ton aircraft carrier, converted from the hull of the 3rd Yamato-class battleship. She had been designed to be unsinkable, her armor nearly a foot thick in places. But armor alone had not saved her. When the full story was told, even the Americans were stunned. Shinano had sailed only 10 days after her first sea trial. with 2,400 men aboard and her watertight compartments incomplete. She had no lifeboats, no damage control manuals printed, and half her pumps uninstalled. Her fate had been sealed before Archerfish ever sighted her. Yet, it was the submarine's crew who turned that vulnerability into reality. For the men of the USS Archerfish, the news came during a post-war briefing. Many sat in stunned silence as the commander explained what they had actually sunk. "Boys," Enright said slowly, "and that ship you put down was the biggest in the, world." Laughter and disbelief filled the room, followed by a long silence as the enormity of it sank in. They had done the impossible. A handful of men in a steel tube, barely 300 feet long, had erased a floating fortress nearly a quarter of a mile in length. The story spread quickly across the Navy. Archerfish became a symbol of precision, courage, and the new face of warfare, a war fought in the shadows, not by sheer size, but by intelligence, patience, and timing. The age of massive warships was over. The sea had proven that it no longer favored the giants. Commander Enright would go on to receive the Navy Cross for his leadership, though he remained humble about his role. When reporters asked him about the attack, he simply said, "We saw a target, we did our duty." He never claimed glory for himself. For Enright, the victory was not about pride, but about the quiet professionalism of his crew, men who had followed every order, trusted their instincts, and executed perfectly in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. In Japan, the truth about Shinano remained hidden for years. Families of the sailors who had served aboard her were told little, often just that their loved ones had died at sea. The Imperial Navy wanted to preserve what little dignity it had left. The name Shinano became a ghost, erased from official records, mentioned only in whispers. It wasn't until the 1950s, when surviving officers began to publish their memoirs, that the story finally came to light. One survivor, a petty officer named Ichiro Tanaka, described the night she sank. The ship shuddered as if struck by the hand of a god. The lights went out. Men were screaming in the dark. We tried to plug the holes, but the water came faster than we could move. I remember climbing a ladder that was no longer there. It had already disappeared into the sea. Another survivor, an engineer, recalled seeing Captain Abe standing calmly on the bridge even as the deck tilted beneath him. He said, "We must not shame the Emperor." Then he ordered us to abandon ship. Those were the last words I heard from him. For decades, the wreck of Shinano remained undiscovered. The coordinates given by survivors were vague, and wartime records were incomplete. But technology caught up with curiosity. In the 1980s, sonar scans revealed a massive anomaly on the ocean floor near the estimated sinking site. When cameras finally descended into the depths, they found her, lying on her side. 4,000 meters down, her hull split and rusted, but still unmistakable. The images shocked even veteran naval historians. The scale was staggering. The hangar decks were still visible, ghostly in the darkness, and the outlines of her great propellers could be seen buried in silt. The damage from the torpedoes was clear, the same 4 wounds. Archerfish had delivered with surgical precision. For the first time, the world saw the evidence of what had truly happened that night. Ocean currents whispered through the corridors where hundreds had once lived. Fish darted through broken passageways. The ship had become a part of the sea now, a monument to both human ambition and human fragility. The ocean, indifferent and eternal, had claimed her, as it claimed all things built by men who believed they could master it. Naval historians still debate Shinano's place in history. Some see her as the tragic symbol of Japan's doomed pride, a masterpiece, born too late, undone by the very haste that created her. Others see her as a cautionary tale about technology without foresight, about the belief that size and armor can substitute for strategy. But all agree on one thing: her end marked the twilight of an era. In the decades that followed, naval warfare would never be the same. The lessons of Shinano echoed in every design meeting, every blueprint, every debate over the future of fleets. Submarines would grow more advanced, carriers more flexible, and commanders more cautious. The ocean had taught its lesson well. As for the men of the USS Archerfish, life moved on. Some stayed in the Navy, others returned to civilian life, carrying with them memories that few could understand. Enright himself retired quietly, rarely speaking about his famous patrol. When asked about it years later, he said, "The sea remembers, even when we try to forget." And so it does. Deep beneath the waves, the Shinano still rests, her vast hull blanketed in darkness, her name whispered by the currents that drift endlessly above her. Every so often, a research vessel passes near her grave, and for a brief moment, her story rises again, the tale of the world's largest warship and the small submarine that sent her to the bottom of the Pacific. It is a story not of power, but of paradox, that in the great ocean, might and size mean nothing against patience and precision. It is a reminder that the sea has no masters, only survivors. And somewhere in the cold silence of the deep, among the shadows and the silt, the Shinano waits still, not as a weapon, not as a relic, but as a ghostly testament to the night when one American submarine changed the course of naval history forever.